I've said before that Mishnah is like poetry. It's very often laid out like poetry, but we need to pick up the patterns. And one pattern we're going to see today is the crossover of the partnership with the rule of 5. So at the end of the last 2 Mishnayot we looked at, in the middle of chapter 6 of the Mishnah of Eruvin, talked about a household who was in partnership with his neighbors, one in wine and the other in oil, perhaps, or perhaps both in wine. And then we learnt about 5 groups who spent Shabbat in one dining hall. And they seem to have partitioned off this big dining hall. Each of the partitions had an opening into the courtyard. And we discussed whether these 5 groups needed to contribute separately to the eruv in the courtyard. Now we're going to pick up this pattern of partnership and 5 again as we go into the 7th Mishnah of the same 6th chapter. We're going to start with brothers. Achin hashutafin, brothers who are partners. Shehayu ochlin al shulchan avihem vishenim bevatehem. They eat at their father's table, but they sleep in their own houses. So this is not, it's not identical to the situation where there are 5 groups of people who've somehow partitioned up this big dining hall. But there is a similarity in the sense that their partnership is not absolute. Yeah, they eat in one place, they eat together, but they sleep separately. And the Mishnah says, Tzrichin eruv l'chol echad ve'echad. Each one must have its own eruv. Just as we learned, by the way, that if the 5 parties had own separate rooms in this big dining space, they had to contribute separately to the eruv as well. Having your own space to sleep seems to make you liable to make your separate contribution to the eruv. And that means, by the way, that if they forgot, then they need to annul their rights. Lefichach, im shachach echad mehem velo erev. So one of these 5 partners, just like one of the 5 groups who are sharing the dining hall, if they forgot to make the eruv, then in order for the other people to be able to operate, they need to give up their rights in the courtyard. Eimatai, when does this apply? This applies when they bring the eruv into another place. And when we learned that the essence of the eruv is that everybody contributes a loaf of bread, or perhaps everybody contributes some flour and maybe we could bake a single loaf of bread out of it. But the point is that this shared food, be it one shared loaf or a basket with a few shared loaves, is going to be deposited somewhere in the courtyard. And we learned, by the way, that the house where the eruv is deposited does not have to contribute to it. By the fact that the eruv is placed there, that is sufficient. So the Mishnah is going to say, Eimatai, when is it that these people have to bring their own contribution to the eruv? Bizman shemolichin eruvan bimkom acher. When the eruv is placed somewhere else, maybe there's some other house in the courtyard where the eruv is placed. Aval, im haya eruv ba etzlan. Maybe the eruv comes to their house or their father's house, most likely. Remember, these are 5 brothers who are these are brothers who are partners and who are eating at their father's table. So maybe the eruv comes to their father's house. At that point, they are already eating in their father's house. They're not sleeping there, but they're eating there. And so in one sense, they're already partners in their father's table, and they don't need to contribute to the eruv as long as it's brought to his house. It applies when they bring the eruv elsewhere. If the eruv comes to them, or here's another case, or maybe there's no other people living in the courtyard. Maybe these brothers and their father are the only ones who live in the courtyard. So, of course, in that case, the fact that they're partners, ha'achin hashutafin, their partner brothers, means de facto they're joined together anyway. Or she'eni mahem diurim bechatzer, einan srichin la'arev. If the eruv is brought to them, or if there's no one else in the courtyard, they need not prepare any eruv. So that's the partner Mishnah. If they're part of a larger courtyard, they have to contribute. If somehow the eruv, if somehow they are all of the courtyard, then they don't have to contribute. What about the 5 then? Remember, we had a case of five groups splitting up a dining hall. Now let's have 5 courtyards opening into one another and into an alley. So try to visualize 5 courtyards in a row. I haven't drawn the houses in the courtyards, but you can imagine the houses running around the inside of the courtyards. And there's a gate from one courtyard to the other courtyard to the other courtyard, so people can walk between the courtyards. And there are also gates from the courtyards into the alley. So the 5 courtyards open into one another and into an alley. And this is the parallel. This really is the parallel Mishnah to the 5 groups who divided up this large dining hall into 5 separate sections with partitions. Let's have a look at the Mishnah. Chamesh chatzerot tuhot zo lazo. 5 courtyards opened into each other. And you can see in the diagram they're opening into each other. Eruvu b'chatzerot. Oh, sorry. Chamesh chatzerot tuhot zo lazo. 5 courtyards opened into each other. Uf tuhot lemavoi. And they also open into the alley. That's the picture we've seen. They open into one another and they open into the alley. Maybe they made an eruv for the courtyards. And this seems to imply that they made an eruv between the courtyards, i.e. they could carry between the courtyards. But they didn't make a partnership for the alley. Mutarin b'chatzerot v'asurin b'mavoy. They can carry between the different courtyards, but they can't carry in the alley. The commentators here say that, look, these are mitzvot d'Rabbanan, but the rabbis didn't want people to forget the mitzvah of making the eruv in the alley, the shituf, the partnership in the alley. So they forbid carrying in the alley unless the partnership had been made. But it doesn't. But the other way around seems to work. For im nishtatfu b'mavoi, if they made the partnership in the alley, if they made the partnership, if they made the partnership in the alley, mutarin kan vekan. If they made the partnership in the alley, they're permitted the use of both the courtyard and the alley. If they, now we're going to see the opposite, it's actually the mirror image of these cases. They made the eruv in the courtyards and they made a shituf in the alley. V'shachach echad mehen, and one of them forgot. V'shachach echad mibnei chatzer v'lo erav. So they made an eruv for the courtyard. They made a shituf for the alley. One of the tenants of the courtyard forgot to contribute to the eruv. Mutarin kan v'kan. We've already learned if the shituf in the alley has been made, that's sufficient for the courtyards. And of course, it doesn't work the other way around. If one of the residents of the alley forgot to participate in the partnership, they are permitted in the courtyards, but not in the alley. The mavoi works for the courtyards, just like the courtyard works for the houses. It's not recursive. It's 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 analogous. It's analogous. The partnership in the alley envelops the courtyards, just like the partnership in the courtyard envelops the houses. It's analogous. What about a courtyard within a courtyard? So this is the next example the Mishnah is going to look at. So look, we got one courtyard which envelops another courtyard. We've got gaps. We got obviously a gap so that people can walk in and out of the inner courtyard. But the people from the inner courtyard actually have to walk through the outer courtyard in order to get to the alley. They have what you might say right of way. They've got a right of way through the outer courtyard to get into the alley. And the Mishnah is going to lean on the fact that the right of way through the outer courtyard gives the members of the inner courtyard a certain amount of ownership rights. Maybe the outer courtyard doesn't just belong to the residents of the outer courtyard. The residents of the inner courtyard have got some kind of stake in it because they have a right of way to walk through it. And perhaps that means that they need to participate in the Eruv. And this Mishnah, so that's the situation. We'll turn to the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is complicated and different people interpret it differently. I'm not happy to say that I understand it fully or can explain it satisfactorily, but at least let's picture in our minds the essential picture. And now let's just turn to the Mishnah. There are two courtyards, one inside the other. The inner one prepared an eruv, but the outer one did not. So the inner one is permitted, but the outer one is forbidden. So they can carry, the people of the inner courtyard can carry around the inner courtyard, but the people from the outer courtyard cannot. So we're okay in the middle, basically. So far we're okay in the middle. Let's keep going. Maybe the outer one made an eruv, but not the inner one. Not the inner one. And the Mishnah says, they're both forbidden. Why are they both forbidden? Well, the outer one seems to be forbidden because it hasn't included anything representing the people of the inner courtyard. So the outer courtyard's made in Eruv, but they haven't made an Eruv with the residents of the inner courtyard. In fact, the residents of the inner courtyard haven't made any Eruv at all. They can't, and they actually can't carry anything out into the alley at all. But, and this is where the Mishnah, it gets difficult to interpret. They both prepared an eruv for themselves. So it sounds like they both prepared their individual eruv, but they didn't make any attempt to share the two eruvin between the two courtyards. Each is permitted on its own. And it's hard to reconcile this statement with the beginning of the Mishnah. It seems somehow as though both courtyards could make an eruv entirely on their own without including the other residents, and each would be permitted to carry in their own courtyard, but not across the courtyards. Not across. Which means, by the way, that the residents of the inner courtyard can't carry across into the alley at all. Rabbi Akiva oser hachitzona. Rabbi Akiva seems to forbid the outer. Rabbi Akiva forbids the outer one. Rabbi Akiva oser hachitzona shed risat haregel oseret. As far as he's concerned, the right of way across it prohibits it. So Rabbi Akiva seems to be going like the first opinion in the Mishnah. Remember, the first opinion in the Mishnah said if the if the outer one prepared an eruv, but the inner one didn't, then they're both forbidden. Rabbi Akiva seems to be saying that the outer guy, there's no point in the outer guys preparing eruv without taking into account the ownership or the possible ownership or the right of way of the residents of the inner courtyard. And the Chachamim, Omrim, the sages say, by the way, the halacha goes according to the first opinion in the Mishnah. The halacha does not seem to go according to either Rabbi Akiva or these sages, but the sages say, Ein drisata regel sarta. The right of way over that courtyard does not prohibit the residents of the courtyard from creating their own eruv just belonging to them. Just a right of way over that courtyard doesn't prohibit the residents of the courtyard from creating their own eruv. And the halacha does not go according to the sages. Maybe the sort of halachic consensus is saying, look, we can't be ignorant to people who are walking over our property, and let's not think we can just shut our eyes to them.